So now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Chris Keefer is a Canadian emergency physician and the president of the grassroots non-profit Canadians for Nuclear Energy. He's also the host of the Decouple podcast, which explores the science, technology and politics of the energy transition. His organisation is widely credited with having reoriented the Canadian national conversation on nuclear energy. This has resulted in the inclusion of nuclear within the mandate of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank and the Clean Technology Tax Credit Framework, and the most recent announcement of 6,000 megawatts of new nuclear capacity in Ontario. Now, Dr. Keefer's activism extends beyond nuclear energy to issues of Indigenous, migrant and refugee health. He co-founded one of Canada's first seasonal agricultural workers' health clinics. He's worked as a consulting physician for the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture and was the health columnist for Canada's largest circulating Indigenous newspaper, the Two-Row Times. So Chris now will speak for about 20 minutes. We'll have then an opportunity for a bit of a fireside chat, and there'll be plenty of time for you to consider some questions. So there'll be plenty of time for questions. But initially, I'd like to hand over now to Chris for his presentation.
I find these lecterns always a little bit awkward. So sometimes I end up doing things like this. I may end up leaning over a bit like this. You let me know. Can you hear me okay right now? Wonderful. Well, listen, it's been a pleasure being in Australia for the first time for this last week. I've not had much time for sightseeing because I'm a big nerd, but I've done some intellectual sightseeing, meeting some truly extraordinary people, and getting a really in-depth picture of the economic and energy realities right here in Australia. So I'm very appreciative of that, and Senator McDonald's talk was the last great mind I've had the privilege of interacting with, and a lot of the communications difficulties that she's describing obviously apply to the nuclear sector. And that's really the role that we've played as a non-industry nuclear advocacy group, as strange as that might sound. So I want to take the time that I have to walk you through lessons from Ontario, which is a province that is 60% nuclear powered, and hopefully inspire a conversation here in Australia about the potential role for nuclear energy. So what got me into all this? As any parent in the room can attest, the birth of a child is a very profound and life-changing experience. Nothing changes one's time perception, one's long-term thinking, like imagining what their lives will be like. And for me, this led to a deep concern about climate change and a desire to take action. Over the last 4 years, I've had the pleasure of speaking with over 200 world experts in the areas of climate and energy on the Decouple podcast. And if anyone has their phone out, I'm assuming that you're subscribing right now, but you're welcome to afterwards. And of course, also founding and directing Canadians for Nuclear Energy. I didn't have to look far for inspiration when I was thinking about how to take climate action. This is a map of the carbon intensity of electricity of many countries and jurisdictions around the world. What you'll notice, of course, is that Ontario is colored dark green. That's good. It's very low emissions. And we move up through the colors into very high emissions. Now, to be on the green team, you need one of two things. A whole lot of hydroelectricity, countries like Norway, which are essentially 100% hydro, or if you are hydroelectrically constrained, significant deployments of nuclear energy, as is the case in Sweden, France, and my home province of Ontario. We didn't used to always have this bright shade of green. In fact, we shared a similar color scheme as Australia does on this map. We were about 25% coal-powered. And over just a 9-year period, we went from 25% to zero. And the replacement energy came at 90% from nuclear. This is the demolition of the Nanticoke coal plant, which I'll describe later. So our countries obviously have different approaches to nuclear energy, different legislation, but we have a lot in common. We share this guy for better or worse. as our mutual head of state, we're tiny populations on relatively giant land masses. We're minerals and natural resources rich. But that's not what matters. Canadians and Australians are practically the same people. We face the same challenges. We fought along each other in the same wars. And I think that's led to a very similar set of values which inform our institutions. We have more in common, though, than that, and it's actually in the nuclear sector. Both Canada and Australia are top 2 and number 4 in terms of global production of uranium. And make no mistake, this is both of our countries' number 1 clean energy exports. Used in zero emissions nuclear reactors around the world instead of the burning of fossil fuels, Canadian and Australian uranium offsets fully 1/3 of our total all-sector national emissions. There's a lot of newsprint that's dedicated to things like green hydrogen, and I'm curious, and this speaks to that communications challenge, why we're not writing more about uranium. We're talking a lot about battery minerals as well in this conference, and they have a vital role to play. But that's storage, not power generation. And if that's storing electricity that is high carbon, that's much less significant than our uranium sector. Another area that we are both giants in, no pun intended, is in medical isotopes. Canada produces enough cobalt-60, and it's actually in our power reactors. They're producing zero-carbon electricity at the same time we're making cobalt-60. What's important about cobalt-60? Well, we produce enough to sterilize 40% of the world's single-use medical devices, things like IV cannulas, endotracheal tubes, stuff that you have all, I guarantee, interacted with over the course of your interactions with physicians and nurses. Australia produces an enormous amount of technetium-99. And I think you should be very proud of the Opal research reactor, which I had the privilege of visiting last week. Just an incredible marvel, and it was obviously completed on budget and on time. And so this technetium is used in the Australasian market as the workhorse, really, of diagnostic imaging. Okay, so what are our differences? After experiencing a week of t-shirt weather in your so-called winter, I can assure you have much nicer weather than us. But the fundamental thing between Ontario and Australia is you guys have big coal reserves and we had none. And I think this is what fundamentally explains the divergence in our energy paths and really our attitude towards nuclear energy. Just because we didn't have it doesn't mean we didn't burn it. After we outstripped our hydroelectric potential in Ontario, we turned to coal. Very reasonable thing to do at the time. We were, however, importing coal from the United States in big barges across the Great Lakes. And we don't go small on anything in Ontario. This is the Nanticoke Coal Station, 8 500 megawatt boilers. If you do the math, that's 4 gigawatts. This was the largest coal plant in North America. Everything was hunky-dory until that energy crisis in 1973. A knock-on effect from the quadrupling of the price of oil, which we used to actually burn for electricity, was a doubling in the price of coal. Luckily, we had begun scaling up our nascent CANDU technology. And as you can see here with each of these blue dots representing a concrete pour at a new Canadian reactor, we built a lot of them really fast in response to this price hike. We went from building the largest coal plants in North America to the largest operating nuclear plant in the world. This is the Bruce Nuclear Power Station. Produces 30% of the province's electricity emissions-free and on a tiny relative footprint. You've probably heard that mantra, oft repeated, that nuclear is just too slow to respond to the climate emergency. Well, here's a graph showing that Canada commissioned 22 large nuclear reactors in just 22 years. That's a reactor a year. How does that compare to global deployments of clean energy? Well, this graph is the average yearly increase in clean electrical generation per capita of a number of countries around the world. You can see, I'm very proud. We didn't make it into the top 3, didn't get bronze, but we're in 4th place there. And what you'll notice is that shade of blue is nuclear. So amongst the 10 fastest additions of clean energy per capita, nuclear takes the cake for 7 of those spots. Australia has done a pretty incredible job with the deployment of solar energy, but it is about 1/3 of the rate of Ontario's nuclear build-out. So how did we do it? There are 3 major reactor technologies deployed around the world. 2 of them are American, 1 is Canadian. This funny thing here, it's the CANDU reactor. What was driving our decision to create our own reactor, not just take on an American design? Well, energy security and local economic development drove that decision making. So we didn't want to become dependent on enriched uranium. We had no interest in nuclear weapons, no interest in uranium enrichment ourselves. So we leveraged our knowledge in heavy water physics to create a reactor that could run on natural, unenriched uranium. In addition, we didn't want to become dependent on heavy forging, which is an industrial capacity that very few countries actually have. And so we created this hyper-modular core made up of 480 fuel channels to ensure, again, that local manufacturing. This supply chain localization, fully 96% of our CANDU supply chain is in province, has some pretty massive economic consequences. Coupled with the incredible high-quality jobs of 76,000 people directly employed in the sector and many more indirectly, we get a $1.40 return in GDP for every dollar invested. It's just like a recycling machine in terms of the economy. There's nothing better than well-paid workers spending money in their community. This does drive our future choices. If we're to spend tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars on a clean energy transition, should we do that at home, paying Canadian workers, fostering high-tech manufacturing, or should we send that money over to, let's face it, geopolitical adversaries like China and import things like wind turbines and solar panels? It's something that we think about a lot in our province. We just had a really good session in terms of Indigenous involvement in the mining industry. This is a good friend of mine, Tracy Primo, member of the Nipissing First Nation, who rose to be the first female shift manager at a North American nuclear plant. You know, as a physician, I was thinking shift manager, you know, maybe it's like the charge nurse who manages when people work. No, she oversaw the operations of the world's largest nuclear plant. The reactor operators were well below her. So really impressive opportunities that are available. And of course, Cameco, our uranium mining company, is the #1 employer of Indigenous people across the entire country of Canada. So would it have been cheaper to have gone a wind and solar route? Well, we ran that experiment with the goal of creating a clean energy manufacturing hub and 50,000 jobs to go along with it. The idea of retooling some of our struggling automotive plants into wind turbine manufacturing factories drove this decision to try and imitate the German Energiewende with, let's just say, very generous feed-in tariff contracts. These were 20-year contracts, ironclad, paid for every kilowatt hour, even if we didn't use it. Curtailed electricity was paid for as well, at rates 2 to 8 times the price of nuclear. Unfortunately, we learned the painful lesson alongside our American and European allies that in energy and commodities-intensive products, you can't compete with China. Their ultra-low cost coal-fired electricity, forced Uyghur labor, and lax environmental standards give them a competitive advantage in this area that's unassailable. How did the cost of our wind and solar build-out compare to our nuclear fleet? So here you can see the Green Energy Act contracts over their entire lifetime, and these are 20-year contracts for sources of generation that only last about 20 years, $62 billion. Our CANDU fleet, in today's dollars, $58 billion. But I think what's most incredible here is the amount of output we've had from our CANDU fleet. For a similar investment, we've had 16 times more electricity produced and produced critically in sync with demand. So the 2018 election was a referendum on the Green Energy Act. In addition to very high prices, rather than experiencing a manufacturing boom, there was actually deindustrialization as a result of those prices. The centre-left Ontario Liberal Party suffered a humiliating defeat, going from a majority in Parliament, losing their official party status, and dropping to only 7 seats. The first act of the incoming provincial Conservative government was to scrap the Green Energy Act, just to give you a sense of what this election was about. The next 4 years of electricity policy on both the provincial and federal level looked something like this. So after having spent tens of billions of dollars and being stung by the resulting high costs, and without any organic forecasts of increased demand, of course we know we need to double or triple our grid, but without those organic forecasts, government was not keen on pouring more money into power generation. We focused instead on incentivizing and subsidizing the use of end-user products like electric vehicles and heat pumps, again, without thinking of the power that's required to electrify those things. And that's starting to bite us in the rear end. So the other things that were occurring at that time were a lingering, pretty peripheral, but in some areas influential anti-nuclearism in government. And that was leading to critical climate legislation excluding nuclear. Things like the Green Bond, or Canada's response to the Inflation Reduction Act, the investment tax, Clean Technology Investment Tax Credit. In addition, we were sleepwalking our way into the closure of one of our crown jewels of clean energy, the Pickering Nuclear Station, which provides 15% of our province's electricity. Into this vacuum of vision stepped Canadians for Nuclear Energy. I founded this organization in 2020, and it's composed of a really amazing, high-caliber group of individuals, including scientists, engineers, and energy workers, and even doctors. I'm not the only one. We have 5 doctors in our membership, which I'm very proud of. So we ran some very successful campaigns. The Save Pickering campaign included a really beautiful policy report written by Dylan Moon over there, and has led to the life extension and refurbishment of the plant. Nuclear was included within that investment tax credit, and critically, we fought for it to be included in the mandate of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which led to a $1 billion loan for Canada's and the West's first grid-scale SMR. We even parlayed that success into a U-turn in federal politics. The same government that in 2021 had excluded nuclear from the Green Bond and lumped it in with the sin stocks of tobacco, firearms, gambling, traffic in exotic species. I don't know why that would be in a Green Bond framework, but they took that inflammatory step of including nuclear with those sin stocks. We're caught in a bit of a dilemma. On the one hand, the Prime Minister's office, and we do have a dictatorship of the Prime Minister's office, was staffed largely by environmentalists, staffers from the World Wildlife Federation, who had a pretty anti-nuclear agenda. On the other hand, there was a working-class electorate in vote-rich Ontario who appreciated the gold standard jobs offered by nuclear energy and the local manufacturing and economic stimulus. So just 2 years later, after much work and a bit of hugging, in 2023, the party had moved to a robust embrace of nuclear. And that was typified by a quote from our dear leader, Justin Trudeau, in which he said, "Canada," and I quote, "is very, very, very serious about a return to nuclear energy." 3 verys. So that statement was made in a press conference alongside the German president, Walter Steinmeier, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. German automotive manufacturing giant Volkswagen was opening its first overseas manufacturing facility. And guess where they chose? Nuclear-powered Ontario. They chose it because of our relatively low prices, high reliability, and very low emissions. Unfortunately, 1/10 that of Australia, not to rub it in too much. So this was in the context of Germany having closed its final 3 nuclear stations. So the irony was quite fitting. And the statement from the Prime Minister was quite gratifying. What is our path going forward? This is Conservative Minister of Energy Todd Smith announcing site preparation for 6,000 megawatts of new nuclear, consisting of 4 small modular reactors and 5 large CANDU reactors. So 9 reactors added to our existing fleet of 18. What gives this minister confidence that Ontario can pull it off when there's been such struggles with nuclear construction in the 21st century in the West? Well, this is an interesting tale. I mean, what explains these construction difficulties? The number one factor by far is the atrophy of supply chains, nuclear project delivery skills, and frankly, skilled tradespeople. American-style reactors, their lives are limited by the reactor pressure vessel, the heart of the reactor. Because we modularize the core, candidate reactors have the option of being life extended every 40 years by the replacement of key parts. It's somewhat analogous to a very complex engine swap out. So what this results in is a reactor that's restored not to an as good as new condition, but even a better condition because we're using improved components and control from our operating experience. How are these projects going? And these are truly nuclear mega projects. We're talking 3 to 4 year projects with a critical path sensitive to a multitude of inputs that have to be dialed in, scheduled, and delivered. 6 months, almost 6 months ahead of schedule in our last unit. I was just talking to a friend of mine. The next unit, they've defueled the unit 40 days ahead of schedule. So things are going very well. We've developed institutional excellence, something I'm very proud of, as you can see. What is the general public support for the expansion of nuclear energy? Well, this is polling from the Angus Reid Institute. 70% of people in favor, 18% opposed, 12% not sure. And this is reflected in a pan-partisan pro-nuclear consensus in Ontario. Even the Green Party of Ontario supports the ongoing operation of our nuclear fleet. Why is that? Well, there's something for everyone in nuclear energy. Right across that political spectrum. On the left, ultra-low emissions, secure union jobs, make nuclear hard not to love. In addition, the example of a just transition of coal workers at our power generation facilities over to better paying and better working conditions in our nuclear plants is hard for them not to appreciate. On the political right, low-cost, high-reliability electricity is making Ontario a very strong investment environment and driving reindustrialization. We've had $17 billion of new investments, mostly in EVs, battery manufacturing, and low-carbon steel. Another reason that nuclear remains popular is that it's kept our prices down. Despite some of the skyrocketing and mouth-watering rates of the Green Energy Act, nuclear is the second cheapest source of electricity after hydroelectricity, and it provides 60% of our electricity. So a real tool that's kept our costs low. So the grid, I call it our civilizational life support system. It is the beating heart of a modern society. And we take it for granted at our great risk. On a very personal note, getting back to, I'm getting emotional. Getting back to my son, he was born 33 weeks early. Sorry, 7 weeks. Woo! That would be very early. He was born 7 weeks early and spent the first 5 weeks of his life in a neonatal intensive care unit in an incubator. And when I think about a blackout, a grid failure, it's gut-wrenching. Ontario safeguarded our grid by keeping it simple, cost-effective, and reliable. There was not the need for vastly expensive transmission and storage infrastructure. Again, nuclear plants are a centralized form of electricity and dispatchable and reliable, and that's the secret of how we were able to replace coal in just 9 years. My friend Mark Nelson has said, you have to love coal if you want to replace it. It's not easy to do. But nuclear matches that reliability and dispatchability without the emissions. Wind and solar, on the other hand, don't have much in common with coal, unfortunately, other than not having emissions. But a huge network of storage, supply, and gas backup is required in order to attempt to match those services. Australia is finding itself, I think, in a situation of a little bit of stress when it comes to the grid. I was reading the Sydney Morning Herald last week, and 4 stories caught my eyes. One was the threat of rolling blackouts coming due to the end of 3 La Nina seasons and that bad boy El Nino coming along, low winds and high temperatures that are going to stress the grid. Another had to do with the need to life extend coal stations to ensure reliability. Another story was about the cost blowouts at Snowy Hydro and some of the transmission infrastructure. And I think I've lost track of what the fourth one was, but it was all stories next to each other. Given the strain that is appearing, it would seem to be prudent to not rule out all of the options at your disposal and include and share with your peer nations in the benefits of nuclear energy. It is my sincere hope that, as in Ontario, nuclear will cease to be a polarizing or partisan issue. For God's sakes, even in the United States of America, the Democrats and Republicans have found something they can finally agree on. As we say in Ontario, the best climate solutions belong in every party. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. A really engaging talk, and do appreciate you coming out here to share that with us. There'll be some roaming microphones, so if you have some questions in your mind, please get yourself ready and put your hand up shortly. But I've got a few questions, and I might start with one that actually came up in the previous session. And can you believe that we're in a position where we'll be threatened? The medicine that we require is under threat because of the disposal of nuclear waste. How do you deal with it in Ontario?
So, I mean, nuclear waste has become this bogeyman. It's put under a microscope as we ignore so many other streams of much harder to manage waste. It's solid, and thanks to the most famous equation in the world, E equals mc squared, it's incredibly dense. The total amount of waste that you would produce in your high energy lifestyle would fit in a can of Coke. This fuel pellet equal to 1 ton of coal, 17,000 cubic meters of gas, 4 barrels of oil. That is the secret to why nuclear waste is so manageable. Fresh out of the reactor, the antis are right. This is deadly stuff. But we make dangerous things safe. I'm sure you can, recognize that in the mining sector. Think about aviation. We put hundreds of men, women, and children into these thin-skinned pressurized aircraft, fly them up to 30,000 feet, far over oceans, and yet it's something like 11 times safer than driving. Similar thing with nuclear energy, except we don't have, an aircraft with 1,000 mission-critical moving parts, the need for air traffic control. We take the waste out of the reactor underwater. Water's an amazing shield. We let it cool off. This is a cool fact. Nuclear waste decays the radioactivity exponentially. So 99.9% of the radioactivity is gone in 40 years. Goes from that underwater storage into a concrete and steel lined spent fuel cask. I've hugged one. I've been amongst them. Got a dose lower than flying in that airplane I was talking about. So this is a very manageable solution. And people say, oh, it's piling up at a nuclear station. I mean, in a Costco-sized warehouse, we have all of the waste from 45 years of the operation of the largest operating nuclear plant in the world. There's no urgency to deal with this stuff, especially when we're thinking about the other waste streams out there, and probably most notably CO2, which is threatening with having us depart the Holocene, which is kind of important for maintaining industrial and civilization.
Thank you, Chris. That's I think a very eye-opening answer. Look, you've been a leading nuclear energy advocate in Canada for a long time, but you actually started out anti-nuclear. Is that the case? So what changed you? What's the moments that caused you to think differently? Well,
Jacob Grieber in his article accurately described me as an old school lefty, and along with those progressive politics come, as with any sort of ideologic package, unexamined beliefs, and so clearly anti-nuclearism was part of that. I used to hold my breath as I drove past the Pickering nuclear station, which is something that is pretty ironic given how much we were able to fix air quality in Ontario using nuclear. But as I was saying, it's interesting. Amongst medical doctors, for instance, the whole paradigm for medical evidence used to be there's a mechanism, therefore it works. that was no longer sufficient. And about 20 years ago, we moved to an evidence-based medicine paradigm where you actually have to test things in the real world in large epidemiological studies and prove that they work. And I think that's equipped physicians with the critical appraisal abilities to look at the anti-nuclear arguments and the pro-nuclear arguments. And if they take the time to do so, as the other physician members of the group have done, you come to a really startling conclusion. And one that kind of feels like a conspiracy theory, because you're like, I know things that the general public doesn't know. But it is a pretty wild journey I've been on. I do this on a volunteer basis. So it gives a certain amount of legitimacy to my advocacy, and I don't even have to call it lobbying because I'm not paid to do it. So just call it advocacy.
Janine Hosig from Seek International, but I'll be wearing a different hat with this question. So I was Radiation Safety Officer for 10 years for Iluka, and before that working in and around density gauges for in mineral processing plants. So on Stradbroke Island I had to decommission a number of uranium gauges because they used uranium in those days. Of course they're all cesium now, but it strikes me again that we had issues on Stradbroke where we had leaking old uranium gauges, massive ones, because we were running 4,000 tonne an hour through a dredge, and I had to get them off the island safely. We've got these similar issues now with the storage of the medical waste, which is in basements everywhere, and so I don't want to revisit the whole Kimber thing. But I'm trying to remember what my question was. But I'm certain that you know many familiar colleagues. We've got a few honorary Australians like Doug Borum, who I'm sure is a very good friend. So Doug comes to Australia a lot and speaks at our events, and also Helen Cook, who's obviously been working in that law area. So can Australians join Canadians for Nuclear Energy?
Pass it behind you, Janine.
Short answer is no. Maybe we'll create a membership class. But listen, I am very heartened by the pro-nuclear advocacy that I see emerging in Australia. I see this young man, William Shackle. It's pretty amazing, the energy that he has. It kind of reminds me of a younger version of myself. I just spent the weekend with Robert Parker, who's a civil engineer, just really has dove into this area and I think is communicating very effectively, particularly in more rural areas. Ben Hurd, who I think is a little less active now. But I think these are the critical voices, the spokespeople that should be making these arguments. And I mean, maybe there's similar, again, there's challenges with mining and nuclear just sounds so similar. But I would say, yeah, have heart and get it going here. Australians for nuclear energy. Be happy to give the cheat codes.
Thanks, Chairman. In the interest of disclosure, Mitch Hook, I'm broken down farm boy, kicked around the mining industry a bit. I bet you're mates with Michael Schellenberger.
It's the relationship status is, as Facebook says, complicated. But what I say about Michael Schellenberger is, I think he's wrong, but I agree with him.
Okay, well,
not on everything, let's just be clear. But
so in Australia, the biggest barrier we have is actually getting a foot in the door. And the AUKUS submarines have given us a foot in the door. Small modular reactors are a foot in the door. We could put 8 of them smack into Hazelwood now and connect them up to a distribution network that works. There's 6, 8 now running around the world. There's about 12 or 14 now in construction. Yes, we can look at thorium and all the benefits that go with that when you can turn reactors on and off and all that sort of stuff. And I love the technology you went through. So give us, if you were in our shoes, what would be your strategic and tactical, and there's a difference, of course, approach to breaking down the barriers? We can't get lost in the logic of our own argument. We've got to empathise and then bring it back the other way. So what would you do if you were in our shoes in breaking those barriers in Australia?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the AUKUS agreement is very interesting. This is an area where I understand there's sort of 24 hours notice, and that did lead to a bipartisan consensus around the necessity of that. I do see some storm clouds brewing in terms of the Australian electricity grid, and I think if those continue to convene, there will be a similar sense of urgency. I think it's really important that we red team our ideas. If Australia goes nuclear, it might not work out. Make sure you have a plan B in place. Similarly, I think, the stakes of getting it wrong or of it not working out are so terrifying because of climate change that we don't even want to think about it, but we have to as responsible decision makers. And so, if getting to 82% renewables in 7 years is not working out, or there's some system reliability issues, et cetera, it is essential to have nuclear at the ready. And I think, overturning the ban, doing some of the preparatory work is a common sense move. But it is very odd seeing a country that's going to be deploying nuclear submarines, that has a world-leading, research reactor producing medical isotopes, that's got, I think, the largest uranium reserves in the world, not deploying nuclear energy. You got a fleet of SMRs coming. I will just say one thing. I hate the word SMR. I find it to be a very imprecise term. It summarizes very divergent technologies and sizes. What is leading the pack right now is very conventional technology. It's not unproven. These are pressurized water designs and boiling water designs that have lineages that stretch back 60 plus years. So, while it's true that there's development work to be done, it's these conventional type reactors that are leading the way, and Ontario, I'm very proud, is deploying the first 4. What should you do in Australia? I mean, you need to find a credible partner. And unfortunately, I'm going to tell you the truth about this. There's not many out there. Korea's done a fabulous job, looking at the revised price estimates of Snowy 2.0. You could build a couple of 1,400 megawatt nuclear reactors with a 91% capacity factor instead of, I don't know what it's going to be, 30%. And if that Snowy 2, if it is charged by coal-fired electricity, that isn't clean electricity, right? So find a credible partner. And I really hope that Ontario, given our excellence with these refurbishments, which are not a perfect representation of a new build, but my goodness, require a lot of institutional excellence. I hope, again, given that we're Commonwealth cousins, we can share something. And, I may be an idealist and an optimist, but I do feel a really strong kinship and bond being here just 1 week.
Sorry. There's a question over this way. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, look, I just got a really simple question. You've been here for a week. I've seen you on TV. I've seen you today. Were you able to have a meeting with anyone in government? And if you did, what was their response?
I have not yet, but I do have a meeting, I believe, tomorrow. I guess I'm going to be just diplomatic, not say who it's with, but yeah. I do think that this issue is, again, unfortunately tribal, and it's, again, a bit puzzling coming from where I'm from. We need to have all options on the table and have a rigorous discussion, debate, but we need to base that in evidence. And I think, this ban is truly, a wonder and a bizarre wonder to behold. But, I hope that you guys get to a place where this is not polarizing or partisan, where the best solutions belong in every party. And I really do think that nuclear fits in there.
G'day, Chris. Thanks for your talk. John Vigenis from Metallurgical Systems. I think in this crowd here, you'll find a lot of people which don't need to be convinced. It's the logical solution. And from someone that also works in uranium and nuclear industries, it just makes perfect sense. So that photo you showed of Opal, I've stood at the bottom of that reactor pool when it was being built.
Okay, good.
So, but the one thing I'd want to ask though is, that's always a fun fact to give people. I've stood at the bottom of the reactor pool. They just poured the concrete and I just snuck in. But the one thing I'm interested in is, because I find the general public is typically energy blind. Yeah. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges we need to overcome. And what I'd be interested in is what happened in Ontario, because I'm usually glass half full, but when it comes to energy, I feel that people need to feel pain before they understand how to transition. Did something like that happen in Ontario, and what was it? Yeah,
we felt the pain of the Green Energy Act. There was, powerful narrative. People that heated with electricity. It was, are you going to buy groceries or heat your house? Right. I heard that there was an issue, I think, with some blackouts in South Australia.
Yeah, that's coming here.
Right, and that led to some pain and to some energy literacy. We take it for granted. The grid has been so stable due to design. Again, it is our civilizational life support structure. To me, it's analogous to the heart stopping and the cascade of organ failure. And we're not talking about these transmission blackouts of a tree falling on a line. We're talking about the potential for a grid to collapse. Came very close to that in Texas, apparently 4 or 5 minutes away. And that is a disaster. 200 people died. That's the most important consideration, but $200 billion in economic losses. So we need to safeguard this most vital commons that we all pay into and supports all of us in ways that we are completely blind to, and I think, hopefully waking up to.
Thank you.
Look, thank you very much, Chris. This has been a fascinating discussion. I think lots and lots of people would have many questions, but I see we're in overtime, and we have the lunch with the Leader of the Opposition across the hall in about 10 or 15 minutes, I believe. So,
if everyone can take your phones out right now.
Yes.
It was so lovely. I didn't see anyone looking at a screen. But take them out right now. Have a search for the Decouple podcast. Subscribe on YouTube and your podcasting platform of choice. We've had some great episodes with some Australians. We're going to have a bunch more. But just do that favor for me.
Thank you very much, Chris.